Okay, in our last video, we left off talking about how when Monroe took office, he was not like other candidates. He had not campaigned. He let his political record stand for itself, and he figured if he was the one that people wanted, then they were going to vote on him based on his work versus what he promised them in campaign speeches. So he stayed in Washington, did his job, and his strategy paid off, and he was elected as our 5th president. And we said that he did not want to be known by a party label, that he was willing to work with people on every political spectrum so that he would be able to have the best people suited for the jobs that he needed to fill. So he appointed John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, which made sense since John Quincy Adams had been part of the Treaty of Ghent. He chose a man by the name of John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun had been a contemporary of Henry Clay. He had been part of the Warhawks, and so he was very much connected to the necessity of if it came to going to war, he would be willing to do it, or he would be able to negotiate that. John C. Calhoun really didn't ever take any kind of official action. He will come back to play for other political offices in the future. Under Monroe, the greatest foreign concern, whereas the other 4 presidents had all had to worry about, first off, was England, and then France, and even Spain. He actually was given a clean slate. But Monroe, unlike Madison, was very good at the foreign policies, and he established what we call the Monroe Doctrine, which is something that capitalized on George Washington's proclamation of neutrality. But we'll get into that later. His one concern was Florida because Spain still had control of it. We did not buy that part from France. All right, sorry about that, guys. I'm trying to get this all done before I leave for the weekend and prepare for my trip to Florida, so I got interrupted. Okay, so I'm sorry if I repeat something that I said what was over an hour ago since I left the computer. But okay, so we said that Monroe's greatest contribution to his presidency was his foreign policies, that he is going to be the author of the Monroe Doctrine, and which will be a piggyback off of Washington's proclamation of neutrality. Now in this era of good feelings, we still do need to settle things with Spain with regards to Florida. Florida was not part of the Louisiana Purchase. That was always a Spanish holding. It had never changed hands. And as I've said before in previous classes, Spain was a hands-off government when it came to its colonies. Once they colonized and they had put their people in amongst the natives of wherever they were, they did not have a direct input in how things were governed. And the same thing had happened. I mentioned that when we talked about the fact that Florida was basically a band of misfits. You had the Seminole Indians who had been kicked off their land because of the Americans coming into Georgia, or I should say the Europeans coming into Georgia. You had runaway slaves, and you had what Spanish had settled there, and they all were, I say a band of misfits because they created a community when they came from such diverse backgrounds, and they were all unified in their dislike of the United States. So in 1810, the Americans in western Florida, so we do have Americans who have settled there, revolted against the Spanish, and let me widen, there we go. And when they revolted, they overthrew, they pushed back the Spanish to a lower part of the state, and then they applied to the U.S. for admission. So think about that. That's going on while we're contending with France and Britain and eventually the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, remember he in the War of 1812 had rushed over to New Orleans? Well, the reason why he was so close was because he was there to defeat the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and that allowed for Americans to settle in what became Alabama. Runaway slaves and Seminole Indians of eastern Florida would raid the American settlements. Obviously, we've talked about that before. And John Quincy Adams asked Spain to intervene and to it's their property, so to speak, and they were expected to send their military to kind of call their people under control. But Spain was like, nah, I don't think so. And they kind of turned a cold shoulder to it and went back to what they wanted to do. And so because Spain was not going to actually enforce authority down in Florida, John C. Calhoun.
Does anyone know if the elementary door to the playground?
John C. Calhoun, the Secretary of War, sent Jackson down to be a hammer, to be, the deciding factor in this conflict at the border and to stop the invasions. Now, the thing of it is that Jackson was given, and this is going to be for Jackson, this is going to be how he is known. He's a bit of a wild card. He's not someone that people can easily read, and he's definitely not controlled by expectations. So when John C. Calhoun sent Jackson down, he oversteps his bounds and actually, instead of just stopping the raids at the border, he invades the Spanish settlements down in Florida. And he goes ahead and he reciprocates the damage that the raiding parties had done on the U.S. side, and he basically gets revenge by inflicting the same kind of damage and destruction down in the Spanish settlements. Well, with that, now Spain pays attention because this is not, this is causing their citizens some hardship. They didn't care to answer when it was our citizens, but now that we've taken revenge, there's no really better word for it. Now Spain wants to demand payment for the damages, and they actually want Jackson surrendered to the Spanish government to go to trial for war crimes with the intention of actually executing Jackson. But Monroe says, no, I don't think so. We're not going to do this. So once again comes another treaty, and this is called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and this finally settles the remaining European dispute with Spain, and we buy Florida for $5 million. And also, it goes ahead and it defines the boundary that would separate the western territory that belongs to the United States versus the Spanish territory that belongs to Spain. And the Mississippi River, was used as one of the borders, and then it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So number 2, in the treaty, the Spanish boundary west of the Mississippi, and it defined the Spanish boundary west of the Mississippi, and it gave the U.S. a defined border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Well, Spain is going to continue to lose her colonies as there are revolutions all throughout Central and South America. And the only one that she, even as she tries to hold on to Mexico, that is going to be lost to her as well. And she just was not when I say she, Spain, the government, was just not able to control all the colonies, and they definitely did not have the military like they once did. They were no longer a world power like they were in 1588. And plus, you had, whereas in American colonies, everyone came here, there was no social status. I mean, yes, you had the rich and yes, you had the poor, but during the American colonies, that was the introduction of the middle class. And so here you actually saw the birth of a new social class, and there was no barriers to someone from any one class being limited to the class that they were born in. However, with the Spanish colonies, they kept things very European. And, the rich stayed rich and the poor stayed poor, and they got even poorer. And this is going to be an earmark of Central and Latin America, South America, for years, centuries to come. We're going to see revolutions plague like Cuba, Argentina, all of those countries. They're all going to undergo their own revolutions all the way up into the 1960s. So there's resentment by the native South American and Central Americans because of the social and political discrimination that Spain implemented in their colonies. They didn't make life better for their colonists, basically. In America, the colonies, for some, no, not for all, because obviously we can't say that of the slaves, but in the Spanish colonies, everybody underneath the rich were slaves. And so there was really very strong social and political discrimination there, and it fueled the revolt. Mexico gains its independence in 1821, and once they were able to gain independence, a lot of other Latin American colonies followed. They were like, hey, if Mexico could do it, we could do it. And obviously they also gained the idea of overthrowing their European power, in short, by watching what the United States had done. And they even try to pattern themselves after our republic. However, because there's a lot of other things that came into that undermined. I mean, they came out with good intentions. They wanted to have a strong restart. They wanted to do it in a way which everybody was treated fairly, but you still had poor economic and educational conditions. These people had never been bolstered with education. No one had come in. They were wholly reliant on the Catholic Church for the reading of the Bible. The Catholic Church had not done very much in instructing children in their learning. And then, and basically the poor stayed poor. So while they may have been free, they were still poor. And by being poor, they did not have the money to support a government. And with weak governments came the ability for a stronger power to come and take over. And again, this is a cyclical process that the Central and South American countries have gone through for at least 2 centuries. Now, when Monroe saw the total instability of the South American and Central American countries, and he saw how easily these countries were constantly changing leaders. You would have a weak leader, then you would have a stronger general come in with an army and take that over, but then as soon as he was leader, he was weak. And then another general with another army came in and took over. When he saw this constant pattern, he really did fear that eventually the European nations would want to retake the Americas for itself as a colony. And so he very much wanted to make sure a loud and strong statement was made to Europe to make them understand that no, the Americas were not open for colonization. And this is where we have the birth of the Monroe Doctrine. So little letter F, Monroe feared stronger European nations would try to take control of the weaker countries, so he established, that's what EST period means, embassies in all of the new Latin American countries. So he, as the American president, put embassies in these American countries and therefore recognized them as countries. And then he issued the Monroe Doctrine. And I'm going to pick up in the next video with discussing the Monroe Doctrine.